Hello, in this video I'm going to discuss with you the ins and outs of a work breakdown structure, or WBS. The project management body of knowledge defines the work breakdown structure as a deliverable-oriented hierarchical decomposition of the work to be executed by the project team. The WBS is essentially the framework that maps out all aspects of the project scope and can be a crucial tool in managing deliverables of a project, such as activity definition, schedule network diagrams, scheduling, performance reporting, risk analysis, controls, and organization. The WBS can be represented in a variety of ways, but two of the most popular are the outline format and the chart format. Here's an example of the outline format for a WBS, where the activities are arranged in a list format, and as your level number goes up, so does your level of detail. Here's an example of a chart format for a WBS, where you can see the hierarchy layout within the project. The very top level includes 100% of the project scope, and each level below that makes up a designated portion of that 100%. In this example, building 1 may be 70% of the scope, which means building 2 is 30%. Expanding from building 1, the design phase may be 15%, which means the construction phase will be 55% of the total project scope. Anything within the scope of the project that will have a cost should be included in your WBS, and if any part of the WBS element can be broken down into further divisions, then you should break it down. Each level is a deconstruction of the project into its own manageable compartments. Now let's jump back to the outline format example. For each level, you will develop your own numbering or lettering system to keep everything in order. Some companies already have a standard in place that you must use. If that's not the case, you can assign any sort of logic with your system, but it should remain consistent throughout the entire project. You can see the numbering system used on this example under the WBS code column on the left. Developing your own standard for the WBS code is beneficial in that it can be used on future projects with similar scope. The lowest level compartments of the WBS are called the work packages. You don't want the work packages to be too detailed or not detailed enough. In order to do this, it's important to realize the WBS's focus is on work deliverables. It should not be broken down into phases or a general list of tasks. Depending on the project, the work package doesn't always have to be a specific task. The last level should all be mutually exclusive from each other and be detailed enough to be a work package you can schedule, budget, and hand off to the team leader. This is a manageable level that can be assigned to an engineer or project team member who can manage that scope. It is important to delegate someone to these work packages so that there is better accountability. That person is responsible for creating that specific plan and making sure it is followed through. Another tip for deconstructing the WBS is to avoid separating the tasks by discipline until more of the breakdown is established. By focusing first on the discipline, you run the risk of having unexpected omission of scope. This usually happens because you are separating the team into their own separate boxes. When the discipline leads are only focused on their own work, they miss the opportunity to communicate with the project team on certain tasks and responsibilities that could be shared. If you are separating by discipline, you are focusing on how it can be assigned to the OBS instead of focusing on the scope and breakdown first. It shouldn't be about the type of work this person can do, but rather what needs to be delivered to satisfy the requirements on a project. It is also not a good idea to organize a WBS in phases. It is okay to think in terms of chronological order when deconstructing the scope, but the inputs of time should be during the scheduling portion of planning or when developing the network diagram or Gantt chart. Putting the attention on schedule when the focus should be on WBS and scope can make you miss portions of that scope. The WBS will be used as a foundation for many project control aspects of the project, so it needs to be done with care and precision. It will come up when dealing with the basis of estimate, product backlog, scheduling, budgeting, status reporting, risk management, quality management, and scope verification. A careful review can sometimes show activities that do not support a deliverable or deliverables that do not support an objective. That's where you either drop it, add, or redefine the deliverable or objective. To illustrate the importance of spending time to break down the WBS as much as possible, let's provide a couple of examples of how situations could backfire if you take shortcuts early. Sometimes a project manager will be working with a limited overall project budget, and they'll set a WBS component for overhead/indirect spending and give it a budget. The project team will later discover indirect items that they did not account for, which may cause the budget to be pushed to its limit. Even if budget isn't an issue, there can always be concerns that come up later in the project, and it will be much easier and better to identify where in the scope this happened instead of searching through a general bucket of overhead spend. Do not underestimate the smaller scope items because a lot of missed smaller scope items can add up to one big missed scope item. This also is the case with engineering during the planning phase. That time must be built out somewhere, and the WBS should be broken down to help identify those costs. There are many cases where engineering actual charges can show up in your data system, but there's no easy way to identify which engineer the charges came from. Knowing exactly where costs will be allocated makes everything clear to the stakeholders, and it will make the costs much easier to track during the project. Sometimes other people will issue purchase orders and allocate them to the wrong WBS. You'll be able to identify these variances and make sure whatever was added pertains to the WBS component scope. Making sure everything is allocated correctly comes in handy towards the end of the project. Many times, a company needs to capitalize the costs within a project. Planning early to decide which tasks or components go to capital versus expense saves a lot of headache. When everything is allocated correctly throughout the project, the assets will be easier to identify, and the team can also identify which areas of scope were impacted the most. You will have much more flexibility and clarity when generating cost reports. Keep in mind what kind of outputs or reports you'd like to see. Let's look back at the example discussed previously. In some cases, the construction component can be split at level 3 into equipment purchases and contracts. That would push everything down one level. The concrete/structural steel/architectural components may or may not be sublevels to the purchases or contracts. That way, you can now run reports that separate the contracts and equipment items. It all depends on the project and how the stakeholders want to see it. Spending time to break down the WBS is one thing, but it loses effectiveness if there's no time spent making sure the project team understands it. Sometimes there will be multiple people creating purchase orders on a large project. If an engineer doesn't know where to bill their time, it could easily get placed in the wrong bucket, and sometimes this won't be obvious until much later in the project when their budget starts to exceed. Communication is an important part of keeping the WBS inputs organized and accurate. To help this process, you should create the WBS dictionary. A WBS dictionary describes each of the work elements. It includes the descriptions of the work product, relationships, risk factors, responsibility, resources required, assumptions, specs, and any other detail that may be beneficial. This helps clarify any specifics that may happen later when team members or stakeholders have questions on the deliverables. This also helps the team identify any duplications. There are programs to help a team build the WBS. Depending on size, some teams may be fine just using sticky notes. I always found that Microsoft Excel is sufficient enough, but you can organize the layout so that each column is another level of the WBS, and when done correctly, you can easily sort through the hierarchy by filtering the columns. Specific work packages can also be found by simply clicking Ctrl F, which lets you search for any specific keywords or phrases. A well thought out and established WBS provides a basis for schedule and process management. The WBS is a tool that helps define the context of the project, it helps assign responsibilities, helps to allocate resources, monitor and control, clarify the work, and it communicates the scope to all of the stakeholders. It will guide the project team through any scope changes and facilitate cost outputs, and ultimately frame the project towards success. ACM is the first approved education provider as certified by AACE International and a Project Management Institute authorized training partner.